The lawyer slid the document across his desk and asked me to confirm I understood what I was signing, and I told him I'd understood it for 30 years before he'd ever drawn it up. My hand didn't shake. That surprised me, given that 2 weeks earlier I'd been lying face down on my own kitchen floor for 11 hours, unable to reach the phone, listening to my own furnace cycle on and off while I waited for somebody to wonder where I was. Nobody wondered. That's the part I keep coming back to. My name is Wallace Pruitt, and I spent 38 years as a master electrician in Dayton, Ohio. I wired half the warehouses on the east side of the city. I rewired the firehouse on Brant Pike twice, once after a flood and once after a kid ran his daddy's truck through the back wall of it. People used to call me at 2 in the morning when their panels started smoking, and I'd get up and go, because that's what you do when people trust you to keep the lights on and the house from burning down around them. I was good at it. I was proud of it. And on a Tuesday in late January, at 67 years old, I slipped on a patch of ice-carrying groceries up my own back steps, and my hip came apart like a dropped plate. I want to tell you about my son before I tell you what I did, because if I don't, you'll think I'm a monster, and maybe by the end you'll think it anyway. That's all right. I made my peace with it. His name is Brent. He's 41. When he was 9, he used to ride along in my work van on Saturdays, and he'd hand me wire nuts out of the bucket and call them out by color like he was a surgeon's nurse. Red, yellow, gray. He wanted to be just like me, and I believed him, and I built my whole life around the idea that someday he'd take the business, and I'd hand him the keys to the van, and we'd be Pruitt & Son painted right there on the door. That van rusted out in 2019. The sign never got painted. Somewhere along the way, Brent decided that being an electrician was beneath him, which I didn't mind, except that he never decided what was above him either. He sold cars for a while. He sold solar panels. He sold something called lead generation that I never did understand. Mostly he sold me on the idea that the next thing was going to be the thing, and I kept writing checks because that's what fathers do, or that's what I told myself. By the time I broke my hip, I had loaned Brent and his wife $84,000 over 6 years. I have the records. I'm a man who keeps records. Every transfer, every just till Friday, every co-signed note. 84,000, not $1 of which ever came back to me. His wife is named Shauna. I'll be fair to her where I can. She wasn't stupid. She was the smartest one in that marriage by a country mile. And that's exactly the problem, because she pointed all of it at me. I lay on that kitchen floor from a little after 7 in the morning until almost 6 that evening. I talked to Brent the night before. He knew I'd had the flu the week prior. Knew I was unsteady, knew I lived alone since his mother passed. He'd said he'd swing by Tuesday to drop off some paperwork he needed me to look at, something about a business loan he wanted me to guarantee. He never came. He never called to say he wasn't coming. The only reason I'm alive is that my neighbor, a widow named Estelle who's pushing 80 herself, noticed my garage door had been open all day in 20-degree weather and walked over to check. She found me. She called 911. She rode in the ambulance and held my hand, because there was nobody else to do it, and she stayed in that emergency room with me until almost midnight, before her daughter came to take her home. 80 years old, a woman I'd known for 15 years and never done more for than shovel her walk a few times. Remember her. She matters later. They admitted me with a fractured hip, 2 cracked ribs from the way I'd landed, and a case of hypothermia that the doctors said could have killed a smaller man. I was in that hospital 8 days. Surgery, then a step-down unit, then the kind of slow, miserable recovery where they make you stand up before you're ready and walk 3 steps to a chair while a girl half your granddaughter's age tells you're doing great. Brent came once. He came on the 2nd day after the surgery when I was still half under and couldn't have defended myself with a butter knife. I remember pieces of it. I remember Shauna standing by the window the whole time with her arms crossed, looking at her phone. I remember Brent standing at the foot of the bed, not the side, the foot, like he was visiting a stranger. And I remember the nurse, a big, calm woman named Gloria, who I'll get to, asking him if he'd be the emergency contact and the decision maker if anything went sideways during recovery. And I remember my son sighing. Not crying, not worrying. Sighing the way you do when the checkout line is too long. "Look," he said, "I've got a lot going on right now. Is there like a social worker who handles this? Because honestly, he's been a handful for years and I can't just drop everything every time the old man falls down." The old man, 67 years old, 3 days out of hip surgery, and I'm the old man who falls down. Like I'm a toddler and not the person who paid for his braces, his car, his wedding, and the down payment on the house he lives in. He thought I was asleep. I wasn't. I learned a long time ago on job science that you find out the truth about people when they think you can't hear them. They left after maybe 25 minutes. Shauna never said a word to me directly, and then for the next 6 days, while I learned to walk again, while they fed me through a straw the first 2 days, and I cried in the bathroom from the pain when nobody was around, my son did not call, not once. 8 days in the hospital and 25 minutes of his time, and the only sentence he gave me was that I was a handful he couldn't keep dropping everything for. You want to know the exact moment something broke in me? It wasn't the floor. It wasn't the surgery. It was the 4th day, when Gloria came in to change my dressing, and she said, gently, "The way you tell somebody a thing you don't want to tell them. Your son called the billing department this morning. He wanted to know what your life insurance situation looked like and whether the house was paid off. He didn't call to ask how I was. He called to ask what I was worth. I didn't say anything. I just looked at the ceiling tiles, the same water-stained acoustic tiles I'd lived at for 4 days, and I started doing arithmetic. Not money arithmetic. I'd done that my whole life. This was a different kind. This was the arithmetic of a man figuring out what he has left and where it ought to go. Here's the thing. Nobody tells you about getting old and getting hurt. You have a lot of time to think. And while I was in that bed, I had 2 visitors who weren't my family, and they changed everything. The first was Gloria, the nurse. She was 61 herself, raised 3 kids, buried a husband, and she did not have a sentimental bone in her body, which is exactly why I trusted her. On the 5th night, she sat down in the chair by my bed during her break and said, Mr. Pruitt, I've been doing this 30 years. I've watched a lot of families come through here, and I want to tell you something nobody's going to put in your chart." She paused. "You don't owe that boy a thing. Not your guilt, not your money, not your name. You spent it all already, and he spent it for you." I told her I'd think about it. The second visitor was Estelle, my neighbor, the one who found me. She came every single day. 80 years old, no car of her own anymore, took the senior shuttle to the hospital and back, 2 hours each way, with the routing they do, just to sit with me for an hour and complain about the daytime television. She brought me real coffee in a thermos because she knew I hated the decaf they served. On the 7th day, she brought me a tin of the molasses cookies she makes every Christmas, except it was January, and when I asked her why she made Christmas cookies in January, she said, "Because you were on the floor at Christmas, Wallace. You just didn't tell anybody." I started to cry. A grown man, 67, an electrician with hands like leather, crying over a tin of cookies. Because she was right. I'd spent Christmas alone, told Brent I had plans so he wouldn't feel obligated, and he'd been so relieved he hadn't even questioned it. That was when I knew where my money was going to go. But knowing where it goes isn't the same as the rest of it, and the rest of it is why you're listening to this. The morning before they discharged me, I made 3 phone calls. My hip was screaming, and the pain medication made the room tilt. But I made them sitting up straight in that bed like I was conducting business. Because I was. The first call was to my lawyer. His name is Desmond Cho, and he'd handled my affairs for 15 years. Ever since my wife got sick, I told him I needed to come in the day after discharge, and I needed him to clear his afternoon. He asked if everything was all right. I told him everything was finally going to be. The second call was to a man named Tobias Reardon. Tobias is a private investigator, a former Montgomery County Sheriff's deputy who'd retired and hung out a shingle doing background checks and asset searches. I'd met him years back on a job where some contractor was stealing copper, and I'd liked the way he worked. Quiet. Thorough. No drama. I told him what I needed, and I told him to spare me nothing. The third call I'll get to. I went home to a house that smelled like the gallon of milk I'd been carrying when I fell, which had sat out for 8 days. Estelle had cleaned up the worst of it, bless her, but the house felt like a place where something bad had happened, because it was. I sat in my recliner with my walker beside me and I waited. Tobias called 4 days later and asked if he could come over instead of telling me on the phone. That's never a good sign. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Brent used to hand me wire nuts, and he laid out folders. Brent and Shauna were $140,000 in debt, not counting what they owed me, which they apparently didn't count at all. Credit cards, a second mortgage on the house I'd put the down payment on, a truck note, a boat I didn't even know they had. Shauna had a storage unit in Huber Heights full of merchandise from some multi-level marketing thing she'd sunk money into, candles and supplements and leggings, none of it moving. That was bad. The next part was worse. The business loan Brent had wanted me to look at. The paperwork he was supposedly bringing the day I fell wasn't a loan he needed me to guarantee. Tobias had pulled it. It was already drafted, and it listed my house, my actual house on Larchwood, the house I owned free and clear, as collateral. Brent had been to a lawyer, not Desmond, some strip mall outfit, and had documents prepared that would have had me signing over a lien on my own home to secure a loan for a business that, as far as Tobias could find, didn't exist beyond a name registered with the state 2 months prior. He was going to walk into my house the day after I'd had the flu, knowing I lived alone and was unsteady, and put papers in front of a sick old man to sign that would have put my house on the hook for his debts, and he'd been annoyed enough at having to do it that he hadn't even bothered to show up. But the part that put a cold stone in my chest was the email Tobias found, and I'll tell you how he found it later because it matters. Shauna had emailed her sister 3 weeks before my fall. I won't quote it exactly because some of it I can't say out loud even now, but the gist was this. She wrote that the old man, meaning me, was circling the drain anyway, and that once Brent got the house signed over or inherited it, whichever came first, they'd sell it, clear their debts, and she'd finally be done holding this family together. Done. Like I was a chore she'd been doing 3 weeks before I fell on that ice. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were tired of waiting. I sat at my kitchen table, and I did not feel rage. People expect rage. I felt something quieter and much more dangerous, which was clarity, the same clarity I felt the first time I stuck a voltage tester on a wire I'd been told was dead and watched it light up hot. You don't yell at a live wire, you just stop pretending it's dead, and you handle it accordingly. Now. The third phone call I made from the hospital, that one was to Estelle's daughter Marlene, who works as a paralegal, and through her I got introduced to a financial advisor named Priya Venkataraman who specialized in exactly the kind of thing I was about to do. Because here's what I'd figured out lying in that bed. Anger is for amateurs. I didn't want to scream at my son. I wanted to make absolutely certain that the future he'd been counting on, the one where the old man falls down and conveniently dies and pays for everything one last time, simply did not exist. And I wanted it done so airtight that no Strickmore lawyer could ever pry it open. Over the next 3 weeks, while I taught myself to walk without the walker, I rebuilt my entire estate from the studs up. Desmond and Priya came to the house because I still couldn't drive. We sat at that kitchen table and we worked. First, the will. The old one left everything to Brent, of course. The new one left him exactly $1, and Desmond insisted on that single dollar specifically, because a person left nothing can claim they were forgotten by mistake, but a person left $1 was clearly remembered and clearly chosen. I liked that. $1. It was the most honest thing I'd ever given him. Second, and this was Priya's idea, we didn't just rewrite the will, we moved the house and the bulk of my savings into an irrevocable trust while I was still alive, with myself as the beneficiary during my lifetime. The reason matters. A will can be contested after you're gone, dragged through probate, lawyered to death. But the house was now owned by a trust, not by me, which meant when I died there was nothing in my estate for Brent to fight over and no house to sign over to anybody. Priya explained it would also protect the assets if my own health declined and I needed care. The man who tried to put a lien on my house had, without knowing it, taught me to make the house untouchable. Third, the $84,000, every loan I'd ever made. Brent, I documented, and like I said, I'm a man who keeps records. Desmond drew up a formal demand for repayment, certified, the whole thing, calling in the full balance with the interest the original note specified. Interest I'd never once tried to collect. The total came to just over $96,000. And the destination for all of it, the house, the savings, what was left after everything, I'll tell you now, because it's the only part of this that lets me sleep. It went into a trust to fund full-ride trade school scholarships, electrical apprenticeships specifically, for kids aging out of the Montgomery County foster system. Kids who have nobody. Kids who, the day they turn 18, get handed a garbage bag of their belongings and shown the door. I'd read about it, how those kids end up homeless at rates that'd break your heart. And I thought about Brent at 9 years old handing me wire nuts, and I thought, somewhere out there is a kid who'd give anything for what he threw away, and that kid is going to learn a trade that nobody can ever take from him. Estelle is on the board of it, by the way. So is Gloria, the nurse, once she retired that spring. I named it after my wife. There was a meeting. There's always a meeting. Brent finally called me about 4 weeks after I got home, and only because the certified demand letter for the $96,000 had landed in his mailbox. I let it go to voicemail. Then I let the next 6 go to voicemail. When I finally picked up on the 7th, his voice came out the way it used to when he was 9 and he'd broken something. That high, tight panic, except now it was wrapped in 41-year-old entitlement. Dad, what the hell is this letter? $96,000? Are you out of your mind? You can't be serious. I told him I'd never been more serious in my life, and that if he wanted to discuss it, he could come to Desmond Cho's office on Thursday at 10 and bring Shauna, and bring a lawyer if he liked. Though I told him not to waste his money on the one from the strip mall. That last part landed. I heard him go quiet. He knew then that I knew about the loan papers. He just didn't know how much else I knew. Thursday came. I wore a suit, the one I'd married my wife in, because I'd lost enough weight in that hospital that it finally fit again. My hip ached. I used the cane now instead of the walker, and I'll admit I practiced walking into that office the day before, so I wouldn't fumble it. Brent showed up with Shauna, and sure enough, a lawyer, a young one, sweating in a suit a size too big. Brent looked terrible. He'd always been a handsome kid, took after his mother. But he looked grey and thin, and he wouldn't meet my eyes, which told me everything. Desmond ran the meeting because that's what I paid him for. He laid it out plain. The will was changed. The house and savings were in an irrevocable trust and could not be contested, attached, or signed over, not by Brent, not by Shauna, not by any creditor, not ever. And the $96,000 in documented loans was now formally due with a payment schedule. And if it wasn't met, my lawyer would pursue judgment, which Desmond noted would be very simple given that every dollar was documented with signed notes in Brent's own hand. The young lawyer started to say something about undue influence, about my competency given my recent medical episode, and Desmond slid a folder across the table without a word. Inside was a competency evaluation I'd undergone voluntarily 2 weeks prior, signed by a geriatric psychiatrist, declaring me of entirely sound mind. I'd thought of that myself. The young lawyer stopped talking. Then Shauna spoke, and I'll give her this. She didn't bother pretending. So that's it? You're just going to cut your only son off over a fall? Over a misunderstanding? And I reached into my own jacket, and I put a single piece of paper on the table, face up, and I slid it toward her the way Desmond had slid his. It was the email, the one to her sister, circling the drain anyway. Finally be done holding this family together. Printed out, every word. I want to tell you how Tobias got it, because I promised I would, and because it's the only thing in this whole business I'm not entirely proud of, and I won't hide it. Brent and Shauna had given me their email passwords years ago, back when they were too busy to deal with the paperwork on a loan I was co-signing, and asked me to log in and handle it for them. I never deleted the access. I never used it either, not once in 3 years, until Tobias asked if there was any way in, and I remembered. So no, it wasn't strictly clean. A judge might have had words about it, but it was their words, in their own account, that they'd handed me the key to. I just finally turned it, Shauna's face when she saw that paper. I'd been in a lot of rooms in my life where the power suddenly went out and people get this look, this animal stillness when the thing they were standing on isn't there anymore. That was her face. She didn't say another word the entire meeting. Brent did, though. Brent finally looked at me. Finally, after 25 minutes in a hospital and 4 weeks of silence, and his eyes were wet, and he said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I am. I know I screwed up. But I'm your son. You can't just give everything to a bunch of strangers' kids. I'm your blood." And here's the part I've thought about more than any other, the part I'd want you to take with you if you take nothing else. I told him, "You stopped being my son the morning you called the billing department to ask if my house was paid off, before you asked if I was alive. Blood made you mine. It didn't make you good." And I spent 41 years confusing the two. I told him the $1 in the will was the truest thing I'd ever leave him, because it was proof I'd remembered him exactly as he was. And then, because Gloria was right and Estelle was right, and a man can be both just and kind if he's careful about it, I told him one last thing. I told him the $96,000 debt would be considered paid in full, forgiven, every cent, on one condition, that he go with Shauna to a financial counselor I would pay for, and to a family counselor I would also pay for 1 full year, with proof of attendance. Not for my benefit. I'd be getting nothing out of it. For his, because a debt that size would follow him the rest of his life. And as angry as I was, I'm not the kind of man who can knowingly sink his own child, even one who tried to sink him first. A second chance, a real one, with a door he had to walk through himself, not a check I hand him so he can do it all again. He took it, or he said he did, that day in that room, crying. Whether he followed through is a different story, and not really the point of this one. That was 14 months ago. I walk without the cane now, mostly. The hip aches when it's going to rain, which in Ohio is always. I see Estelle most evenings. We have dinner, nothing fancy, and she still makes those molasses cookies, and we both pretend it's not a standing arrangement. Gloria comes by Sundays. The scholarship fund placed its first 4 kids in apprenticeships this past fall, and I drove out to watch one of them. A 17-year-old girl with a chip on her shoulder the size of a transformer strip and land her first wire. She did it clean. I didn't say anything. I just stood in the back where she couldn't see me. An old electrician watching a kid learn the only kind of inheritance that can't be spent or stolen, and I thought about a boy in a van calling out colors. I don't hate my son. I want to be clear about that. Because hate is just another thing you carry, and my back's bad enough. I don't hate him. I just stopped paying for him. There's a difference, and it took me 67 years and a broken hip on a sheet of January ice to learn it. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole story, whether I'd do it different, whether I was too hard on him. And I tell them what I learned lying 11 hours on a cold kitchen floor, listening to my own furnace, waiting for somebody to wonder where I was. Nobody's coming to wonder for you. You have to be the one who decides you're worth wondering about. I decided too late to fix my son. But I decided just in time to save myself and to leave behind something that lights up for somebody who actually needs it. That's not revenge. I know they call these revenge stories. But that's not what it was. Revenge is what you do when you want to hurt somebody. What I did so I'd finally stop letting somebody hurt me. And I sleep just fine now. For the first time in years, I sleep just fine. 11 hours on a cold kitchen floor teaches you arithmetic. They don't put in any textbook. Not the kind I'd done my whole life with wire gauges and load calculations, but the kind where you add up what a life actually came to and subtract everyone who didn't show up for it. When the only person who wondered where I was turned out to be an 80-year-old widow next door, and not the son I'd handed $84,000 and 41 years of my heart, the math came out plain. Cause and effect. I had spent decades teaching Brent that the money would always be there, that the house would always be waiting, that no matter how he treated me, the well would never run dry. And he learned exactly what I taught him. A boy doesn't grow into a man who asks the billing department about your life insurance before he asks if you're breathing, unless somebody trained him, by accident or by softness, to see his father as a resource instead of a person. I was that somebody. I won't pretend otherwise. But here is what I want you to carry out of this, because it cost me a broken hip to learn it. Being a good man is not the same as being a soft one. For years I confused kindness with surrender, and I called it love when really it was fear. Fear of losing him if I ever said the word no. Real decency has a spine in it. It can hand a son a single dollar and a forgiven debt in the same afternoon and mean both completely. Because doing right by someone sometimes means refusing to fund their ruin. That took me a long time to understand, and I only understood it because I finally stopped reacting and started thinking. I didn't scream at Brent. I didn't beg. I sat down at the same table where he once handed me wire nuts, and I planned, the way you plan a circuit so it can't short out and burn the house down. Clear-eyed, patient, documented. Anger is loud and stupid, and it changes nothing. A man who thinks before he acts can rebuild his entire future in 3 weeks from a recliner with a walker beside it, and none of it would have mattered without the hard part, the part nobody claps for. Standing up before you're ready, walking 3 steps to a chair while the pain makes the room tilt, and then doing it again the next day and the next, because the only person who was ever going to decide I was worth saving was me. I could have stayed on that floor of self-pity a lot longer than 11 hours. Plenty of people do, for years. Instead, I got up, in every sense of that word. So I'll leave you with the thing I tell the few who know all of it. Nobody is coming to wonder for you. You have to be the one who decides you are worth wondering about. And then you have to be honest enough to see people as they are, smart enough to act instead of rage, and stubborn enough to keep standing when standing hurts. I decided too late to fix my son, but I decided just in time to save myself.